So somebody asked me why it is that I owe Matt SERRA an apology. So I'm making this video to explain why and to give you guys a little bit of context about Judo and Jiu-Jitsu and the martial arts back in the 1990s, specifically in the New York City area. Okay, so bottom line is I owe Matt SERRA an apology because he and I did randori, which is what we call sparring in judo, stand-up sparring session for judo, and I was a jerk and I shoved him into this hard rock wall at OISHI Dojo. Now, he said he doesn't remember that, but regardless, that was not the right thing to do, so I was wrong in terms of what I physically did in this little sparring session. But even more so, I was incorrect for the attitude I had towards Matt and other jiu-jitsu people at that time. Now, I didn't even know Matt's name. The beauty of it being him was that so many years later, I could reach out, figure out that maybe it was Matt SERRA, and he confirmed that. So if it wasn't Matt SERRA, it would just be some jiu-jitsu guy that showed up at our judo dojo on a Friday night, and I probably wouldn't be able to find them and say, hey, you know what, I was wrong, I'm sorry. But in any case, let me give you a little more context of what that dojo was like and why there was this exposed rock wall. Well, this was at OISHI Dojo, which back in at that time in the late 90s, it was located at 69 Leonard Street, which is in Tribeca, New York City. Tribeca stands for Triangle Below Canal, so indeed Leonard Street is a couple blocks south of Canal. I believe the dojo was between 5th and Broadway, but I can't remember exactly. But Tribeca at that time was not a trendy area. Like, especially after work hours, the street was pretty much abandoned. Every now and again in that area, a very trendy restaurant or club would open up and be a hot spot for a little bit and then sort of run its course and close shop. But for the most part, those streets were just dark. There wasn't a lot happening. And to explain why there's an exposed rock wall in this dojo, well, Shiro Oishi, the head instructor at OISHI Dojo, somehow managed to find this space. Now you gotta understand, any type of floor space in Manhattan is like very difficult to find. So for anybody to open any type of martial arts school, it's a super challenging thing because you need that open space with no obstruction, with no posts like right in the middle of your floor space, right? And in Manhattan, I mean, you have buildings that are so narrow. Like, you have homes that are literally between 15 or 20 feet wide on the outside. The exterior walls of brownstones can be that narrow. So same thing with these office buildings in Manhattan. They're like, they go from one exterior wall smashed right next to another exterior wall. Everybody maxes out the floor space. So Shiro Oishi found this spot for his dojo in the at least 3 sub basement of this building at 69 Leonard. So you had to take this tiny little elevator to get down there. I imagine I think there was a very steep staircase because of course you need 2 means of egress, but in any case, by the time you get down to the dojo, okay, as you enter, you know, you're facing this rectangular room. On the left side and right side of the long sides of the rectangle, those are 2 exposed rock walls, exposed bedrock rock walls. And the way Sensei Oishi had this set up was the mat went right to the edge of those rock walls. Now you might ask, well, why didn't he, finish the walls and, put up some sheetrock or something? And I'm guessing the reason is because he would have lost like a couple feet of floor space if he did that, at least. Because these bedrock walls were really uneven. You know, they jutted out and would go in. And so by the time you go to the, you know, by the time you add furring to those walls so you can put up sheetrock, yeah, you probably lose at least 2 feet, one on either side. And as I said, you know, you want to max out your floor space. So the way that dojo was set up, Sensei OISHI had gotten some, like, I guess about 2 inches at least thick of that polyurethane white foam mat. I'm not sure how he built it up because I never saw that, but then what he did was he put that all the way to the edge of these 2 bedrock walls. Now on the far side, from the entrance to the mat area, I think it was windows. I don't really remember, but I think it might have been windows that just looked out onto this dead space, this air shaft. But in any case, so there's this white polyurethane foam. Those of you guys who did martial arts back in the day, remember this. It was one of the most common ways to create mats, because we didn't have a ton of mat companies back then. Let me come back to that in a second. So there's that polyurethane mat, and then what Sensei OISHI had done, he had like custom made this cover to go over that mat, and he had by himself put rivets in this thing, and then had this kind of rope system where it was taut and then attached to like a framework around the mats. So pretty creative on his part. But the point here is that the mat went right up to this bedrock wall on one side and the other side. So if you're looking at the dojo as you're entering it, that left side rock wall is exposed, and the right side rock wall was also exposed, but that right side is what we call the shomen side. So those of you guys who are familiar with martial arts know that in a dojo, there's what we call the shomen side, where that's the side of the mat where the senseis sit. And so when you start a class formally, all the students in this case would be on the left side of the room. The senseis are on the right side, on the shomen side. They're facing each other in seiza, in kneeling position. Head student calls for everybody to, you know, line up, sit down, meditate, stop meditating, you know, bow to the sensei. So both sides bow to each other. And then the sensei side has to turn around and face the shomen side. And then the head student says, you know, we bow to the shomen side. And then senseis turn back around and say what they have to say to get the class started. But point is, when you're doing randori, we would never ever go over towards the shomen side of the dojo, but you might gravitate to the other side. Now, at OISHI Dojo, I mean, because there were those exposed bedrock, it was kind of like an unwritten rule that you didn't use the bedrock, like you didn't use that as part of your randori session. You're not supposed to like try to shove somebody against the bedrock and you know, then use that to try to get a throw or something. So I was completely wrong for, of course, grabbing anybody and then trying to shove them against that rock wall. Now, so let me backtrack a little more. I had said, you know, you got these mats that go right to the wall, and that it was very common for a lot of dojos to use that sort of system of just getting polyurethane foam 2-inch thick and then putting some type of surface on top of that. The reason is like we didn't have like Swain mats or Dolomer that was started by Mike Swain, and we didn't have Fuji mats, which was started by Jimmy Pedro. We also didn't have Zebra mats. I'm not sure who started that company, but you know, props to all of those companies because they're entrepreneurs. They saw sort of a gap right in the market, and they started providing proper tatami, you know, the 1 meter by 2 meter mats to, you know, dojos across the United States. But we didn't have access to that. So that back in that 80s, 90s, at that time, if you had those tatami mats, that meant you imported them probably from Japan, maybe from Europe, but either way, very expensive. So very few places, very few dojos could afford to make that purchase, number one. Number two, when you're trying to max out your floor space and you have kind of somewhat awkward edges, the tatami, the 1x2 mats, you're not going to be able to max out your floor space. So that's why there was even, the possibility of like coming in contact with this uneven surfaced bedrock wall. Now, sometimes when it would be cold, because we're so far down in that sub basement, the walls are cold, and then once everybody starts sweating and moving around, condensation would form on those walls, and those walls would actually start to sweat themselves, So that's just an aside to give you a little visual. But now here's the other thing. At that time in New York, the New York area in the 1990s, there was not a lot of jiu-jitsu going on. There was actually more places where you could practice judo than you had the opportunity to do jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu wasn't like as normalized as it is now, because literally everybody and their grandma and their dog does jiu-jitsu. I mean, there's even a guy named Paul Hunter who does jiu-jitsu with his dog on IG, and it's pretty good. I mean, he demos valid BJJ techniques on his dog, who's actually a really great uke. But in any case, my point is, nobody really did jiu-jitsu back in the 90s. And at that time, it wasn't really, Brazilian jiu-jitsu wasn't like a thing. So I'm guessing that's one of the reasons that Matt SERRA and company would come all the way from Long Island to Manhattan and go to OISHI Dojo, because that was one of the few places where there was, somebody doing jiu-jitsu. And then I assume that Matt SERRA and his other jiu-jitsu buddies just decided, to do judo randori with us on one Friday night. So I was incorrect, because instead of having an attitude towards them, I should have been more like welcoming and say, oh, hey, that's pretty cool. You're stepping outside your comfort zone and joining us. But I had like a completely different attitude back then, just because of the person that I was, which was like, I was competing in judo. I was like super serious. I definitely had a big ego. So my attitude walking in there was like, hey, wait a sec. I saw these guys on the mats, and one of them was Matt, and I noticed he had on like, I guess probably a blue belt. So in my mind, I'm seeing this blue belt on the mat that I've never ever seen before. I'm going, hey, wait a second. I know everybody in the tri-state area, meaning New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. I know everybody who does judo. So how did this guy just suddenly show up with a blue belt on? So like my assumption, because I come from a judo background, is that you go white, yellow, orange, green, blue. So in my mind, he's jumped from white belt to blue belt, and I've never seen this guy before. So I'm like already like, what's up with that? Like, who is this person that just showed up with a blue belt? Now, I didn't know that in jiu-jitsu you go from white to blue, so that's the second belt. But regardless, here's my ego just kicking in. Like, how can I not know who this person is? So I asked my buddy who was at the dojo that night. I was like, hey, who are these guys anyways? And he goes, I don't know. I think there's some jiu-jitsu guys. And I'm like, and now here's where my attitude super kicked in, because I was like, jiu-jitsu guys. They think they can show up at OISHI Dojo on a Friday night and do randori with us? No way. Okay, so here's the context for that, is that Friday nights specifically at OISHI Dojo, that's when the mat was hot. That means, judo's a very small circle of people, and we just through word of mouth, we know where we say the mat is hot on a certain night of the week. So for example, Tuesday nights, it was just known that Cranford Judo and Karate Center, which was run by the late Yoshisara Yonesuka, who was an Olympic coach, whose son Nikki made the 1980 Olympic team, and whose grandson Jack just fought in the previous Olympic Games. But so Sensei Yonesuka would just say, "Hey, call me Yanni," so everyone just called him Yanni. But it was just known that Tuesday nights at Cranford, that mat was hot, and if you're gonna show up to do randori there, you better be ready to rumble. Like, don't expect anyone to give you a shoulder to cry on, because it was just rough and tumble, and that's just how it was. Now, similarly, a little bit not quite as competitive as Cranford. The mat was hot Friday nights at OISHI Dojo, 69 Leonard Street. It was actually a really fun time, because you would go Friday night, you judo your butt off, and then we were in a great location to then head off to go get some food in Chinatown or Midtown or wherever. It was always fun. It was always an adventure post judo workout for sure. So that was one of the pluses. But because it was just known that OISHI Dojo the mat was hot on Fridays, I just thought it was like, wait a second, how come these, who are these jiu-jitsu guys? How dare they think they could come, onto our judo mat? So I took it like a personal affront, which was, of course, completely silly and completely incorrect. So at some point, I wind up doing a randori session, apparently with Matt SERRA, and then just caught an attitude and like shoved him against the wall. And the reason I remember that is because as I was doing it, his eyes got a little big like that, and then I snapped out of it. I was like, oh, okay, I've gone too far, like back off, and then we just finished, we finished the sparring. But it took that moment for me to like snap out of it, seeing his eyes get a little bit big. So yeah, I don't remember what happened in the rest of that randori, but what I will say was that I just remember that individual, who happens to be Matt SERRA, was completely a gentleman about it. He wasn't trying to like muscle me, or wasn't trying to like go hard or be awkward or be a jerk about it at all. He was 100% just trying to work with me, and he was a gentleman. So yeah, I was completely at fault for having any kind of attitude, no matter what, right? No matter who that individual was. But let me tell you just a little bit more about sort of the whole judo versus jiu-jitsu thing. Like I said, at that time, I really think there were more places where you could do judo in New York City or that area. And I would bet money, I know for sure, there were definitely places out in Long Island where you could do judo. So the fact that Matt SERRA and Ray Longo would come all the way into Manhattan to try to find a place to do jiu-jitsu just tells you like it was a completely different world in terms of people having access to practice jiu-jitsu back in the 90s in New York City. So for example, like I'll tell you about the judo dojos I know of. So there was OISHI in Tribeca, that's the most southern part of Manhattan. There was another very small judo school in the East Village. I think it was on 8th Street, but I'm not sure. I just remember it being in the East Village. I can't remember the name of it. But the mat space there, I think, was even smaller than OISHI Dojo. There was judo at the McBurney Y on 23rd Street. I'm not sure if that's still there or not, but that was there for a long time. Like Sensei Matsumoto taught that class. I think it was Mondays and Wednesdays, if I'm not mistaken. Then there was judo at the New York Athletic Club. So if you were a guy and you could get invited in, at that point they weren't allowing women in, so I think I might have gone there once or twice just as a guest to watch only, but I couldn't step on the mat. So New York Athletic Club is at 59th and 5th Avenue. Beautiful, beautiful facility. If you ever get the chance to be invited in there as a guest, you should go like to any part of that building, just because it's just an experience in and of itself. Okay, so there was judo there. Then there was judo. Trying to think where else. Further uptown, like there was judo way uptown at the Buddhist Academy or at the Buddhist Center. I think it was like 106th and all the way over on the west side. I think that was. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of that instructor. And then there was also a dojo around 28th Street. It was a judo dojo within a larger institute called Kenzen Institute, or Kenzen Academy, something like that. So it was a whole building devoted to different Japanese martial arts. So there was a room for judo. They also had aikido, kendo, kempo, karate, and I believe they might have had jiu-jitsu in there as well, like traditional jiu-jitsu. So it was a very different world back then. So dojos were just typically there were these very small spaces. They were kind of dingy because these weren't money makers. You were weird, or you were sort of outside the norm if you did judo or jiu-jitsu. It was not something that you would take on as an instructor with the idea that you're gonna make a ton of money on this and sell tons of memberships and et cetera, et cetera. So at this point, like in the 2020s, it's sort of normal to have martial arts academies that are like what I would call like a super dojo, right? You've got like 5 mat areas, you've got a weight training room, you've got cardio equipment, maybe you have a sauna, maybe you have an ice bath machine or cryotherapy machine. But there's all of this is included in this huge space. But back in the day, dojos were just, dingy little places that only like the true fanatics would gravitate to. And then outside of Manhattan, there was a dojo way out in Brooklyn that was run by the Kanakogis. I can't remember the name of their dojo, but I do remember you had to take the 2 or 3 all the way to the end of the line near Brooklyn College, and their dojo was a little bit beyond that. If you go out to New Jersey, again, Cranford, New Jersey, that was Sensei Oneska's Cranford Judo and Karate Center. And then also in New Jersey, Sensei Ogasawara had his dojo. I can't remember what city in New Jersey that was in, but both of those were within reach of New York City. So it was a very common thing for anybody who was a competitor or at least a brown belt, certainly if you were a black belt, it was completely permissible for you to do what we call dojo hopping, meaning you kind of had a home dojo where you paid your monthly dues. So in our case, that was OISHI Dojo. But then, you could, as a brown belt, competitive brown belt or black belt, we were welcome to show up at Cranford on Tuesday nights, or even McBurney, try to get in as a guest on a Monday or Wednesday night. And the thought there is that if you're, brown belt, black belt level, you have something to contribute to the other students on the mat, doing randori with them, which is absolutely true, and that's how the martial arts work. And the higher ranking belts should be able to work with lower ranking belts and not necessarily give direct instruction, but just by virtue of being able to move around with them, the lower belts should be able to pick up on just how to move with judo, how to flow. And just to point out one major difference between, say, judo sparring, which we call randori, and boxing or striking sparring, is that in judo, we'll do sparring, we'll do randori like every single practice. And in fact, in some cases, that's almost all we do. Like we may not do that much drilling. The drills are almost just as part of the warm-up. But there's oftentimes, especially on those randori nights, there's not going to be any direct instruction where the sensei says, you know, everybody circle up and I'm going to show you something, I'm going to teach you something. Instead, it was understood like at Cranford, you know, we're not doing that. We're just going to do little warm-up drills called uchikomi. Then we're going to get into, I don't know, maybe 5 rounds in newaza, meaning ground fighting, which is what BJJ has pretty much morphed into, is just ground fighting. So we'll do like maybe 5 rounds of that, and then it's stand up, and that's it for the rest of the evening. At the end, Yanni was a real fan of having us do our sit-ups and push-ups, so that always happened as well. As a side note, somebody posted something about Sensei Kimura. This was based on a clip from Doug Rogers' documentary when he was training with Sensei Kimura in Japan. Doug Rogers was a Canadian judoka. In any case, someone said something about, he said they're going to do 600 push-ups. Does he mean in one class? And it's like, yeah, probably back then I can see, you know, somebody, a coach like Sensei Kimura demanding that his competitive judoka do 600 push-ups, because I think we would do 200 standard routine. And, you know, it's like these guys are doing 2-a-days with judo, and that's all they're doing. They're just preparing to compete. So for sure, he could demand that they do 600 judo push-ups. So yeah. So that's just a little bit of a bit of context for those of you who, you know, who maybe haven't done much judo, just to give you an idea of the fact that, yeah, we'll spend the majority of the practice just sparring. And the reason we can do that, and you can't do that in like boxing or kickboxing, is because, I mean, we're not taking impact to our head, you know. It shouldn't be. Anyways, as long as you know how to fall properly, you can get thrown umpteen times during your practice and not get hurt and not get injured. The only thing that might get hurt is your ego, right? But, you know, it shouldn't be a thing after a while, because by the same token, you're going to get the opportunity to throw your partner. And so it just becomes more, hopefully it's more fun than it is stressful for you. And so the other thing about, to give you the context of judo and jiu-jitsu back in the 1990s, judo people always, and still do, like kind of hold ourselves separate from all the other martial arts. Like we don't really mix and mingle and go, say, try Thai boxing class one night and then jump over to, I don't know, some other martial art on another night and then go back to judo. We just pretty much just stick with judo. And so in many ways, a lot of judoka don't really consider themselves martial arts, or don't really put themselves in that bigger picture of being a martial artist, because we see other martial artists as kind of strange and kind of weird, like that whole McDojo kind of, you know, I could kill you with one finger thing. We're just like, whatever, you know, like we're here to get our throws and our pins in and everything else. Like that's what we love, is landing a perfect judo throw. So overall, we're sort of a separate entity from the rest of the martial arts, proudly, I would say. And part of that has to do with the fact that judo has, since the mid-60s, judo has been an Olympic sport. Now, by that virtue, it means there's only one set of rules. Every tournament, it's the same set of rules, from kids all the way to adults, and anywhere you go in the world. So that's a big difference between judo and, say, other martial arts, because even with jiu-jitsu, you know, some tournaments you go to, I imagine passing the guard is worth X number of points. Another tournament, it might be worth a different number of points. Some tournaments, if you enter, they'll allow only maybe straight leg locks. Some other tournaments might allow the straight leg lock and the heel hook. But my point is, it's not like that in judo. I mean, in striking competitions, there's even more variation in the rules from tournament to tournament. So by virtue of judo being the Olympic sport, it's unified, number one. So we have a unified set of rules, and then we have a unified language in terms of talking about the different techniques. So that's part of the reason why we kind of hold ourselves apart from all the other martial arts. But I think the other aspect of it is that in the end, none of the techniques in judo are designed to permanently hurt, to permanently injure, and certainly not to kill. That would be in terms of all the techniques that are allowed in competition. So for example, straight armbar, that's the only armbar that's allowed in judo because the elbow is the fastest healing joint in the body. Now if you start doing other types of locks, you can put pressure on the shoulder. We also don't allow any pressure on the neck. So you can choke with the uniform, you can choke with your bare hands, but you can't do like a guillotine and you can't do a neck crank. So that's just another aspect of judo that I think attracts certain types of people, and then we kind of stick with that because it just fits our personality or just fits who we are well. Now that said, of course, I stepped away from judo for a long while, and took up boxing. So I think that happens with a lot of martial artists once they kind of get to black belt level and competitive black belt level for a while. If they started out in a striking art, they start kind of moving over towards exploring what grappling arts are like, or vice versa. I think personally that that's just natural. Once you've been a black belt for a while at your martial art, you're going to want to kind of spread out just a little bit and explore. But that said, I wasn't in that type of mindset at that time back in the 1990s because I was still being a devoted competitive judoka and conjuring up this ego in order to be a competitor. Now, all that said, I have to say I do have a ton of like really great memories of my time at OISHI Dojo, and just going out to Cranford once a week to train there, just trekking to different dojos, sometimes even going all the way up to Albany to train with Jim Herbeck at his America Judo school. And judo has done a lot for me just as a human being. So I encourage anybody to take up the sport of judo, take up the art of judo. If you're at all curious about it, just try it. So in a nutshell, I really do owe my entire life to judo because it shaped me into the human being that I am, from being a kid to being an adult. And I think it's pretty cool that I'm able to come full circle and actually find and identify Matt SERRA and give him an apology. So that's kind of the beauty of being involved in the martial arts and being able to find people on social media. So thank you very much for listening to this story, and let me know if you have any great memories of your dojo or your martial arts school from back in the day, from pre-social media days. I'd love to hear it in the comments. Thank you.